On Story is brought to you in part by the Alice Clayburgh Reynolds Foundation, a Texas family providing innovative funding since 1979. On Story, presented by Austin Film Festival, a look inside the creative process from today's leading writers and filmmakers. In this week's On Story, Loving writer-director Jeff Nichols.
You think as a filmmaker you can do anything, and I've tried to support that notion in that I've gone from a revenge thriller to a psychological thriller to a coming-of-age fairy tale to a sci-fi chase movie, now to a period drama. But those are just genres. The aesthetic that I have, I'm afraid, is beyond me. It's going to be there in everything I do, whether I really want it to be or not.
In this episode, Jeff Nichols discusses bringing history to life in his intimate civil rights film, Loving.
In here?
What you doing in that bed, boy?
Richard! What you doing in bed with that woman?
I'm his wife.
That's no good here. Get your pants on, boy. Get out of that bed.
Get out of that bed!
You know, I think if somebody had come to me and said, hey, Jeff, do you want to make a film about the civil rights movement? I probably would have turned them down. I'm a white guy born in 1978. I'm probably not the best person, you know, to lay that story out for people. But in this particular instance, I think it is kind of an apolitical film because they were apolitical people. You know, they had no agenda. They weren't trying to force us to feel anything or do anything. They just loved one another. And in a strange way, because they were obviously part of the civil rights movement, but also somehow separated from it, I felt like I understood their story. So the political consequences, though massive, felt like they lived just by benefit of the nature of the story, and not something that I had to sell or pitch or weight one way or the other. You know, the Lovings had taken care of all that for me. So that aspect really, I don't know, I just felt like I had good guides in terms of the Lovings. As far as writing something based in fact, I just did as much research as I possibly could and had access to. And at some point, I just had to know, or I guess come to terms with what I didn't know and say, well, I'm gonna have to make up lines for these people. I don't know 100% if they said it, but I feel like from the research that I've done, I understand the essence of who they are, and I don't think I'm gonna put anything in their mouths or make them do anything on screen that would betray the nature of who I think they were. That was kind of the deal I made with myself. I got a call from my agent, and he said that Martin Scorsese wanted to talk to me. And I said, well, I would like to talk to him. And he just said, I'm a big fan of your films, and I would like you to consider this. And at that point, I'd already watched the documentary, and I had an idea, you know, which was to follow the Loving's point of view. And I said, look, you know, this is gonna be a really slow film. It's gonna be a really quiet film. And I think you could actually make a movie that actually has a chance of making some real money. And he said, no. I think you're right on that. I think it's all about the people. And that's what really got me started on it. Now, of course, when I looked at the documentary, I was immediately drawn into Richard and Mildred. They're kind of undeniable as people. And there was enough archival footage of them and Gray Villette's photographs that you just quickly get a sense of who they are. But also, these people very much reminded me of my grandparents, who obviously weren't interracial, but My grandfather, you could sit with him for hours and he might say 5 words. But I never, I never didn't understand how much he loved us, my brothers and I. But when you're married to a man like that, my grandmother very much became, the emotional kind of mouthpiece for the family. And I very much saw that in Mildred, and because of the type of man that she was married to. But in this case, instead of just being, the emotional champion for the family, she also had to be the one that spurred on a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
You go to the Virginia State Court next, right?
Yes.
You nervous?
I suppose. The lawyers told us not to expect much.
You think you'll lose?
Well, yes. But I think it's all right. We may lose the small battles, but win the big war.
Neither of them are like Aaron Brockovich-type characters. They're both very sort of like shy, reluctant heroes. And I wonder, as a writer, if that was difficult to have these sort of passive characters at the center of the story.
Well, anybody that's seen my movies, my characters don't talk a lot anyway. So it was actually quite fit in my wheelhouse quite well. I grew up in Arkansas. My extended family grew up in small towns all around Arkansas. They were working class people. These are people that I just understand. I hear their voices in my head, and it makes sense the way that they relate to the world. Their inability to always articulate themselves or their emotions or feelings, that's something that I'm pretty used to. And so no, actually, I think it would have been harder for me to write something that had 2 bombastic figures at the center of it that were very verbose. I think that would have been more difficult for me.
Mildred and Richard both seem so young at the beginning of this, Mildred in particular. And it was really just such a pleasure to watch their maturation. And I feel like we come to fall in love with them and see in each of them what they see in each other. And I wondered if that was a conscious decision on your part to have us get to know them that way.
Well, sure. I mean, Mildred's the most active character in a film that doesn't have much action. But if you really look at her trajectory, I find her, most fascinating. In that first half of the film, Richard's really driving things. Richard proposes. Richard says, let's go up to D.C. and get married. Richard says, I'm going to find a lawyer. All of that really kind of fails in a lot of ways. And I think she was 19 when they got married, and she was just following his lead. And I think there are a couple of moments when she comes out of jail for the first time, and he's not there at the house. And then when finally the judge hits that gavel and they're exiled from their home for 25 years, I think there's this maturation that begins.
The court does accept the plea of guilty and fix the punishment of both accused at 1 year in jail. The court does suspend said sentence for the period of 25 years upon the provision that both the accused leave Caroline County in the state of Virginia at once and do not return together at the same time to said county and state for the period of 25 years. Do either of you have anything to say?
No, sir.
No, sir.
You are released from custody, sell your court costs with clerk.
Thank you, Your Honor.
It's hardened through this period of depression in D.C., and what we're watching is, I think, a young girl become a woman throughout the course of this film and understand her place and her role in this family as well as in this movement as a whole. Now, obviously, there are a lot of different ways to protest, and she wasn't grabbing a sign and walking the 6-7 blocks, whatever it was, to the National Mall and being part of the march in '63. But I think she understood, or she began to understand her place in all of that.
They say over 100,000 people there.
Standing by along the parade route at 17th and Constitution.
Can you imagine?
Might as well be halfway around the world.
At this particular spot, we had expected the marches to just
Nothing.
about now begin. However, some 15 minutes ago, the march got underway.
You know what you need to do?
And the enthusiasm,
What?
particularly among the young people.
You need to write Bobby Kennedy.
Some of the groups coming in from the
I'm
other
serious.
states, which have
I
been
mean,
involved in the
that's what they up there for.
of,
All this talk of civil rights. You need to get you some civil rights.
engaged in demonstrations before. In the background, you can hear some of the young people shouting.
I think it's one of the most interesting things about the film is watching this woman slowly over time evolve into this very mature woman that is actually becoming kind of the master of her family's destiny.
This film felt driven by emotion, by love, and by homesickness. And I know that you're a note cards writer, and I'm just curious to know if your approach to writing Loving was different from past films.
Not entirely. I still did the note cards. I had this idea before this story even came to me that wouldn't it be interesting if you were telling a film, especially a rural film, that moved in seasons. And this was an opportunity to use that. Obviously, we had about a decade of ground to cover. And rather than just using time signatures or chyrons on the screen to say, now it's 1963, I felt like it would actually be more impactful if you just felt like time was slipping away. Because that's really the thing that is so tragic, is they were robbed of time. Time being able to live the life that they wanted to live in the place that they wanted to live it. And especially when you read that final title card about Richard, the fact that he only had 7 more years on this planet to live with the one that he loved in the place that he loved, it makes it all the more tragic. So I wanted people to feel time just slipping through their fingers. And the way we did that and the way I built that in the script was through seasons almost more. I was obviously keeping track of the years, but I wanted you less concerned with that and more concerned with just this kind of unstoppable march of seasons and kids being born and growing up that is happening over the course of this 10 years. So structurally, that was kind of a unique thing to this particular story. I mean, there's no climax in the film, really, not in any traditional sense, like 3-act structure. Obviously, there's the court case and the verdict, which is certainly climactic. But what I realized early on is in that back third, there was going to be an emotional climax, which for me is Richard coming home from that bar and just saying, I can take care of you, I can take care of you.
Let's go to bed.
I can take care of you.
I know that.
I can take care of you.
One, it seemed extraordinarily emotional to me, but also it seemed to sum up exactly where they were. Because when a guy is telling his wife, I can take care of you, and we all know that that's not true, how painful that must have been for him, and how she must have so wanted to support him in that moment. When I had that scene, which was reverse engineered after finding that quote, which is a true quote of hers before she passed away, saying, I miss him, he took care of me. I went back and reverse engineered that scene, and then I felt like I had my climax. It was just gonna be a really, really subtle one. And you might not even know it's happening while it's happening, but that's what it is in my mind. I made this film called Take Shelter, and I think, thanks. And there are like 2 funny lines in that movie. And it's tough, you know. There's definitely no calculation for it. There's no metric. I'll say this. I think, though, if you're really trying to represent life and a decade of life, you know, you have to have something in there that breaks through. I think audiences need it. I would probably argue the stuff in this film is really not that funny, but you guys laughed at it because you needed to. And that being said, though, when you watch the documentary, Bernie Cohen's funny. It's like watching an episode of The Office. Like anytime he's on camera, he's like looking at the documentary crew. And he was definitely performing, you know. And Nick and I talked about that. His voice is a little bit different in the second lawyer meeting than it is in that first. It's because I think he's giving a performance in that first meeting.
Come in. Mrs. Loving.
Hello.
Please have a seat. Bernard Cohen. It's a pleasure. Thank you for coming in today. So, as we discussed on the phone, the ACLU would like to take on your case. I was actually a charter member of the ACLU in Virginia, which is why they assigned me to you. The bottom line is, we want to get you all some relief.
I thought he was a showman. I thought he was funny. And so when I was reading that script, actually, when I sat down and printed it out and read it for the first time, and those lawyers showed up, it was like, thank God. Like it was a gear that we desperately needed to shift into in order to keep this thing going. Had they not existed and we just stayed in that world, I just don't think we could have made it. I don't know if that scene ever happened. That's one that I had to create. There was a lot of documentation about the first half of this film. They had retold the story several times about being arrested, about being tried, about being jailed, about going to DC, about her cousin coming in and saying, you need to write Bobby Kennedy. Like all that happened, and it's very well reported about them returning and being rearrested. All those things happened. The rearrest didn't happen exactly the way that I did in the movie, and I can talk about that. But for the back half of the film, it was very difficult because they were in hiding, and there just wasn't much information about their day-to-day life. I would probably guarantee you that there were more harrowing events in their life that they had to deal with that I didn't specifically have an example for it, and I didn't want to just fall back on whatever ideas I had about the civil rights movement and what life was like back then to paint something in. I just didn't want to do it. But I had to do something to represent this very extreme situation that they were in. And I thought the most honest approach there would be to think about the psychological threat that they had to be living under. This idea that day in, day out, they are living under the threat of somebody coming up that road that at best would be a police officer to arrest them. At worst would be much, much worse.
Cindy! Cindy!
I want you to go next door to the neighbor. You're gonna ask me the telephone, you're gonna call Raymond, ask him to bring his gun, right? Go on now, run through the wood. Go on.
Everything okay?
It's fine.
Richard?
Go on inside.
So the threat of a lynching scene, the threat that we all know happened and in the South, and we all know could have happened to them, that seemed to be equally as compelling to me as just inventing a scene from scratch that showed violence or aggression. And there's an extension of that too. I found it really fascinating that a white man in the 1960s would endure and had to live under this psychological threat that so many people in the black community obviously had to live under, and probably in some instances still do. And as kind of a way to extend the point of view of this film, hopefully it makes people in this audience that might usually just watch a lynching scene, for instance, and watch it from a distance, actually pull their point of view into the experience that these characters are going through, and say, I can understand this psychological threat that they have to live under day in, day out. It was a creative decision, but it was also almost an ethical decision on my part in terms of the way I wanted to represent what I knew and what I didn't know in this story. I hope that's a fair answer. So I have a giant cork board up in my office, and before I start typing anything, I can sit in my chair and look at that cork board, and there's a note card for every single scene in the movie, and I can watch it in my head. And so I've already done revisions at that point in terms of the narrative structure. Sometimes there are a few changes, but not often. And so when I'm done typing, I print it out on paper, and I take it to a different location, and I have a red ink pen, a felt ink pen, and I sit down and I read it from cover to cover. I put my phone away. I don't let anybody interrupt me. It usually takes me about 3.5 hours. And from that kind of moment, I know if that structure really held up and if it worked. I make a few changes, and then I'm done. And for this script, it's unlike any other script I've ever written. It was pretty well done on that first draft. I sent it off to the producers, who are lovely, and they had about a page of notes that you would expect, notes that I even kind of assumed I would have to deal with, like maybe we need more of the lawyers, I don't know, some other random things. And so we're gonna have this phone call about these script notes, and I hate script notes. But these are really great producers, and I wanted to listen to them. And about 3 minutes before the call, I get a text from Sarah Green, my producing partner, and she says, Scorsese's gonna be on the call. And I didn't even know he had read the script, and neither had the other producers. And he gets on the phone, and everybody else is quiet. And he's like, Jeff, this script's wonderful. This is a very delicate script. And I was like, wow, thank you so much, Mr. Scorsese. Did you have any notes? No, this is very delicate. It's a very delicate script. And I was like, does anyone else have any notes? and there was just silence. And then I felt bad because they were getting bullied. And so I said, well, you know, I've heard that maybe there should be more scenes with the lawyers. What do you think of that note? It's very delicate. Nope, it's very delicate. And then I brought up another note, and he's like, nope. And I brought up a third note, and he goes, it's delicate. Like, don't change it. I was like, all right, thank you very much. And I changed 2 typos, and that was it.
You've been watching A Conversation with Jeff Nichols on Story. On Story is part of a growing number of programs in Austin Film Festival's On Story project, including the On Story PBS series, now streaming online, the On Story radio program and podcast in collaboration with Public Radio International, and the On Story book series available on Amazon. To find out more about On Story and Austin Film Festival, visit onstory.tv or austinfilmfestival.com.